Came this morning for a 4-hour sermon and you didn't realize you were coming to a shipwreck, did you? It's a joke on the 4-hour sermon in particular, but I could probably talk for 4 hours, but I'm not sure I could preach for 4 hours. So anyway, we're going to be looking this morning at Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 through verse 5, and then we'll jump over to Exodus chapter 32, verses 1 through verse 24. And we're in the second week of our series, Your God is Too Small. Last week we looked at Job. And we talked about how, in particular in America, and I'm sure it may be in other cultures as well, but I can speak to this one because this is where I have lived all of my life. Not necessarily in Texas, but close enough in Louisiana. So anyway, we won't go into conversation about that. But here in America, we tend to, you know, if you talk to most folks about their religious lives, we sort of prefer a God who is small and who is manageable. One who's just a little bit larger than us, maybe just a little bit smarter than us. What we discovered last week as we looked at Job is that that's not the God of the Bible. That the God of the Bible is way too big to be put into a box. The God who not only created the heavens and the earth, but created, you know, all of the stars and put them in place and called them by name and all the different things where, you know, we talked about last week where Job had all these questions and God says, okay, Job, would you like to be in charge of everything for a day? I mean, I'd love to turn it over to you. I'll maybe take a nap, go on vacation, or do something. You be in charge of things. And Job's like, I don't think so, God. I'll let you stay in that place. And so the God of the Bible is a God who's way too big to be put into a box. And yet we tend to try to control him and to manipulate what he can do or what he is supposed to do. Another issue that we're going to talk about here today in America is that we also have a tendency to, or many of us have a desire to have a God that we can shape into the form that we like. I read where one guy referred to a Build-A-Bear God, that we can go in and we pick out which animal we want to build, and we can choose what clothes we want to wear, and we can figure out how much stuff we want, how big we want him to be, or how soft or how firm. We can figure all those things. Or another guy referred to it as a buffet God, that we can sort of go through the line and we can choose what part of God that we want so that we can build a God just like we want him to be and that he can make us, you know, feel all warm and snuggly. Or we can, you know, a God who will zap our enemies and help us. Matter of fact, I heard this week, sort of embarrassed that I was listening to a guy who, he always comes to the Southern Baptist Convention, and every year he brings up a bunch of resolutions, and everybody knows who he is. I started to say his name, but then you might go Google him. But, I mean, every year, and he's really sort of annoying, and then he became sort of a comic. Well, this year he's not going because he's mad about something, and he's praying imprecatory, is that how you said it? Is that right? Sort of like that. In other words, prayers of judgment on those who he disagrees with. I'm going, wow, man, what kind of God do you have? I mean, he's like a genie. You can say, hey, you know, zap Richard. I mean, he may be mad this week. No, he really doesn't make me mad this week. But anyway, and so we sort of want this God that we can control. But the problem is that this issue really isn't just reserved for Americans. Matter of fact, we see it in the Bible. Matter of fact, when God laid out his 10 commandments or his 10 words, which is the foundation of really everything that God has laid out for us, how we are to live our lives, that we are to love the Lord our God with all our heart, our soul, and our mind, and we are to love our neighbor as we love ourselves. And the 10 words can be contained in those two great commands. And so in the second of those commandments, or the second of those words, God deals exactly with this issue of trying to manipulate and build a God in which we can worship as we want. You may remember the first commandment is what? Do you remember? That we're to have no other gods before him is the first God. And we think about other gods. What would be other gods? Other gods would be really anything or anyone that we put in the place of God. It could be our spouse. It could be someone that we look up to who's been our mentor, someone who becomes like a God in our life that we exalt them to a place that only God should hold. It can be our relationships, our family. It can be wealth. It can be jobs, which that seems really odd that a job would be your God. But I think especially maybe in ministry in particular, it could be true. Sometimes even the church can become someone's God. And when someone hurts someone's feelings in a church, or they don't like the church, or, you know, I can't believe that church built that big fancy building when there are people starving on the streets of whatever city, you know, so I'm not going to church anymore, then the church has become that person's God. And when the church no longer fit that what they thought it should look like, then we don't need it anymore. And I'm a Christian, I'm going to heaven when I die, but I don't need the church anymore. But the second commandment, as we look at it, the second commandment really sort of overlaps the first, but it looks at it from a little bit different dimension as we think about not having any other gods. In Exodus chapter 20, verse 4 and verse 5, and I'm reading from the Christian Standard Bible, it says, "Do not make an idol for yourself, whether in the shape of anything in the heavens above or on the earth below or in the waters under the earth. Do not bow and worship to them and do not serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, punishing the children for their father's iniquity to the third and fourth generations of those who hate me." And so the second commandment, or the second word from God, it warns us against having the wrong object of worship or against worshiping in the wrong way. Carved images were really man-made objects to worship. And these idols really have no true comparison to the one true God. They're impersonal, they're powerless, they are deaf, dumb, and dead. They have no authority, have no ability even to speak in our lives, not only to not hear our prayers, but they can't answer them or do anything for us. But it also carries the idea of adding some image to God, and we'll see that as we jump over to Exodus chapter 32. The people of Israel, not only had they gone back and looked at these gods of Egypt, and trying to implement them in, but they also have a false understanding. They begin to try to bring in this idea that we can make an image that's going to represent the one true God, because we can't see him, so we're going to make an image, but he's going to be an image of the one God, and so we're going to worship this idol, and by worshiping this idol, we're worshiping God, and yet God is strictly forbidding that. And so as we move into this story in the book of Exodus, as we move further in, we find God's people struggling with this very sin, and I want us to sort of walk through Exodus chapter 32, verse 1 through verse 24. And we're not going to read all these verses. In fact, we're going to skip over one of the sections where really there in that section, really Moses talks us a lot about how to pray for God's people as they're struggling in the area of sin. But I want us to focus in really on this story and this idea of fashioning a God that we can sort of mold into the God that we want him to be. And so we'll sort of walk through this together. We'll begin in verse 1. It says, "When the people saw that Moses delayed in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said to him, 'Come, make gods for us who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him.'" So we may remember that Moses has gone up onto Mount Sinai to meet with God, and while he is there, he receives the 10 Commandments, or the 10 words. But Moses was gone longer than the people had expected him to be gone, and so they began to panic, believing that God and Moses both had abandoned them. And really, we think about this idea of God abandoning them, especially the people of Israel during this time, and you look at what has happened in even the month previous, it almost seems crazy to think that they would all of a sudden think that God had abandoned them. Just to quickly remind you of what has happened, even in this month before, God had delivered them miraculously from really what was the most powerful empire of that time, the nation of Egypt. God had delivered them from bondage of slavery there in Egypt, using the 10 supernatural plagues that God used. Some of them happened really on all the land, and some happened just on the Egyptians. But God supernaturally had delivered them from the hands of Pharaoh through these plagues that God had placed upon the nation of Egypt. And then it doesn't end there. As the people are leaving Egypt, God stirs the heart of the people who have wealth and who have influence, and God begins to stir their heart where they are moved with compassion for the people of Israel, and they literally take all their gold earrings and all their gold and they give it to the Israelites as these slaves are going off into the wilderness. Is that not pretty amazing? And so they leave with all this stuff that they didn't work for, that God just delivered from their enemies, had given them all this stuff as they leave. This God who now has abandoned them. And as they travel through the wilderness, God leads them with a pillar of fire at night and a pillar of cloud by day, which represented God's presence. How do we know which way to go? So God said, okay, during the day I'll have a pillar of cloud that you'll follow. At night, it'll be fire. And so you'll be able to follow that through the wilderness. Then they arrive at the Red Sea. With the armies of Pharaoh bearing down on them, the Bible tells that God split the Red Sea so the people of Israel could walk across on dry ground, and then God closed it in upon the armies of Pharaoh. And then God supplies the people with both bread and meat each day, with manna and with meat. I had somebody ask me yesterday, so can we make manna? I said, well, manna sort of came from heaven, so I'm not so sure about that. But you can maybe figure out some secret recipe. But God had been working in the lives of the people of Israel throughout this process, not just in some invisible way where God is behind the scenes working, but God had been visibly working in and through their lives. And yet here now, Moses has gone longer than what they thought he ought to go, and so they begin to question, well, maybe Moses and God has abandoned us. Let's continue on in the story. Verses 2 and verse 3. It says, Aaron replied to them, take off the gold rings that are on the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me. I guess that means we shouldn't complain if people have a bunch of piercing, right? I mean, they had them all over. Their children, their sons, their daughters, wives, they all had earrings. So all the people took off the gold rings that were on their ears and brought them to Aaron. Again, think about this. This is jewelry that had been given to them by the Egyptians, and now they give it to make this idol. In verse 4, he, talking about Aaron, took the gold from them, and he fashioned it with an engraving tool and made it into an image of a calf. And then they said, Israel, these are your gods who brought you up from the land of Egypt. Think about that as we read a little bit further along in the lesson, that Aaron took the gold, he fashioned it, and made it into an image of a calf. And we'll see the significance of that a little bit later on in the story. And then in verse 5 and verse 6, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar in front of it and made an announcement. There will be a festival to the Lord tomorrow. Early the next morning, they arose, offered burnt offerings, and presented fellowship offerings. And the people sat down to eat and drink and got up to party. So we think about this. So Moses and God has abandoned us, and so we want a new God to be able to worship, but we're not really sure if he's going to be like the gods that we saw in Egypt, or if is he going to be the Lord who led us out of Egypt. But we want this idol that we can sense him, and he'll be with us, that we can hug him and we can kiss him, we can bow down before him, and we can worship him because we can see him with our eyes. And so we're told here that they believe that they're still worshiping the Lord of all gods. As a matter of fact, they may have even said to themselves, it's fashioned in the form of a bull. Well, they may have said, remember God told us that we were to offer a bull in offering, so that's what this little bull remembers. We're not really worshiping a bull. We're worshiping the fact that, instead of having to sacrifice a bull, we got one here. He's all made up. We'll bow down and worship him. But Aaron makes a calf and declares a festival to the Lord. The next morning, we're told the people get up early in the morning. They offer their burnt offerings, offer their fellowship offerings to the Lord. And then the people sit down, they eat, they drink, and they get up to party. Now, the Hebrew word translated to party here in the Christian Standard Bible, it carries a very strong sexual connotation that, they just all broke out. Listen, when you come to a worship experience, you really don't expect that kind of a party where you're getting drunk and involved in all kind of crazy sex. That's basically what is going on there. Matter of fact, at the end of this service, if a bunch of you start taking off your clothes, we're going to have to call the police or something and have you arrested or, taken to somewhere to get checked in for some help. So Moses is in the mountain. In verse 7, we see where God responds to what's happening there in the camp. In verse 7, God says, go down at once. Can you imagine hearing that voice? Go down at once. For your people you brought up from the land of Egypt have acted corruptly. We'll jump down to verse 19. As he, talking about Moses, approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, Moses became enraged and threw the tablets out of his hand, smashing them at the base of the mountain. That's a bad place, isn't it, where you got God is mad and Moses, the leader, is mad. Not a good place to be. Verse 20, he took the calf they had made, he burned it up and ground it into powder, and he scattered the powder over the surface of the water and forced the Israelites to drink the water. And so we see here where judgment is beginning, because God caused this gold they swallowed to make them sick. Many of them became very sick that day because of their rebellion against God. And then in verse 21, Moses asked Aaron, what did these people do to you that you have led them into such a grave sin? I love Aaron's response because it sounds like something a middle schooler would come up with. He says, Aaron replies, don't be enraged, my Lord, my leader. You yourself know the people are intent on evil. It's not really my fault. It's these evil people that you left me with. You brought them out of Egypt, and you left me with them. And their desire, they're going to do evil. You know how they are. And they said to me, make gods for us. Who will go before us, because this Moses, the man who brought us up from the land of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. And then in verse 24, so I said to them, whoever has gold, take it off. And they gave it to me. And when I threw it into the fire, out came this calf. And so we read earlier that he took an engraving tool and he created this idol that they would worship. But now when he retells the story, how he remembers the story was, these corrupt people came and said, hey, do this. And so he threw the gold in the fire, and this golden calf just jumped out. Well, if the calf could have jumped out of the fire, then maybe he'd be a God worthy of worship. If he actually could move and do something, but we know that's not the case. And so in verse 23, we see where Aaron blames Moses. If you hadn't been gone so long, and you would have left me with such corrupt people, none of this would have happened. And then in verse 24 again, he says, I just threw the gold in the fire and the gaff just popped out. As we consider this story this morning, I want to point out three truths about counterfeit gods. Those false gods that, if we're all honest, now we'd say, well, I don't have any idols in my house. You ladies say, well, when I go to get my nails done, I don't bow down to the little idols that many of those places have in them. I don't bow down to Buddha. I don't bow down to these idols. But the reality is, if we're real honest, it is very tempting for us to bow to all kinds of idols. That we put all kinds of things in the place of God. And we make all kinds of excuses about why we can't serve the one true God because we have all these other gods that we would rather worship and follow, these gods that we have created in our own image. But I want to quickly share three truths about counterfeit gods. First of all, counterfeit gods grow out of our fears. Counterfeit gods, what they do is they as we begin to face real enemies or real times of need, out of our fears, we begin to create gods who can sort of step in and take care of our problems. And so as we think about the people of Israel, they really did face real enemies and they faced real needs, and they found themselves struggling to trust in a God they could not see, so they created an image of God they believed would bring comfort and peace into their lives. And they fell for this false idea that they weren't really rejecting God, they were just sort of reshaping him into a form where he guarantees that he would give them what they want. Man, it sounds like our world, doesn't it? We think about how we do this sometimes. We feel like we need money and prosperity in order to be happy, so we invent a God who guarantees happiness and wealth. A great example of that is Jesse Duplantis, a pastor in New Orleans, or evangelist in New Orleans. I wouldn't trust anything the man said. If he told me the sky was blue, I would have to go out and look to make sure it wasn't some other kind of color. I mean, he comes on and says that God has told him he needs a $54 million new jet. He's already had 3 other jets, but he needs a bigger jet, one that he didn't have to stop and refuel. That's not the God of the Bible. That's not the God of the Bible, that you come out and you make these goofy claims that God desires me to be wealthy and healthy and wants me to be happy. And that's not what God's purpose in our life is. I mean, I heard something the other day that somebody that I actually respect said, God wants us to be happy. I'm not sure it's the same sense of happiness that we think about in this world. Because some of the people that we see around the world go through more struggling and more suffering. I mean, what do you say to a Christian in North Korea, that's strapped onto the front of a tank and they blow them up with a mortar shell? Or they lay them out, as Christians, they lay them out on the ground and run over them with a tank, or they nail them on a cross and crucify them. What about this God of happiness, this God of health and wealth? Where is he? Is that a God of the Bible? And yet, oftentimes, in the American church in particular, we talk bad about these health and wealth preachers, but oftentimes in our own personal life, we really practice that type of theology in our personal lives. We say one thing with our mouths, but if you look at our lives, the first time something goes bad, we lose our job, we have an unexpected speeding ticket, or whatever it is. God, you got to provide for this need in my life. You got to take care of me. Is that what God is required to do? We also like, or when we like to see ourselves, we like to see ourselves better than others. So at times we invent a God who is angry at some kind of sin in someone else's life, and he's not so angry about the sin in my life. You understand what I'm saying? Isn't it amazing, especially for those of us who struggle with legalism, how we can see every sin in everybody else's life? Man, that person's so full of pride and arrogance. Golly, I can't believe God hadn't already zapped them. Or, man, you ever heard the foul words that come out of that guy's mouth? Man, how can God bless that? I mean, we are so easy to pick out the sins of somebody else's life, and yet we struggle with seeing our own. And that's what happens is we've created our own God who's more concerned about their sin than he is about our sin. Or we need family stability in order to be happy. So we invent a God who guarantees that, and if he doesn't come through, then we become angry that he let something go wrong. What kind of God would allow this kind of mess to happen in my family? Why my family? Why not their family? Why not somebody else's family? And that's not, God doesn't guarantee family stability. Go back and read through the scriptures, in particular the Old Testament. How many great saints of God have children who've come up and who have rejected the faith and have done all kind of crazy stuff? Or we want unchallenged sexual freedom. We want to better, live and let live, want to do what we want to do. So what we do is we invent a God who says that it's okay, I'm okay, you're okay, and we can do whatever we want to do, and it's all right. That's not the God of the Bible. And one of the tragedies of these counterfeit gods is that when they don't answer our prayers the way we think they ought to be answered, then we become angry with the one true God. We become angry. Well, man, I don't need that church stuff. I talked to some others here recently, not here, they actually live in Louisiana. And they said, I don't need that church stuff. I tried God, and He didn't restore my family. He didn't answer anything I wanted Him to do. That's a total misunderstanding of who God is, isn't it? I mean, God's not there just to restore your family, even though God does those things. God's not there to make everything easy and smooth in your life. Matter of fact, the Bible says that when we become believers, oftentimes things become more difficult. And so we become angry with God because He didn't do things the way we thought they ought to be done when our understanding is so limited. And we talked about that last week, that God's understanding is limitless. It is eternal. The second thing is that counterfeit gods corrupt us spiritually. In Exodus chapter 32, we find the people of Israel had this distorted view of God, and the result was the people moved from the worship of this, they moved to the worship of this counterfeit God, and they moved from there on into sexual perversion. We think about this in the same way. Listen, if our God is holy and just, but He is not compassionate and gracious, then we ourselves become mean and judgmental religious people. And some of the meanest people you'll ever meet are church people, right? Some of the meanest organizations you'll ever find are churches. That they are just mean and hateful and spiteful. What happens is they focus on the holiness of God and the justice of God, but they've denied His compassion and His grace. But also we also see the other extreme where we so focus on God's grace that we ignore His righteousness and His holiness. And what happens then is that we begin to move into a place of compromise with the culture that's around us, and everything around us becomes acceptable. We begin to call good what God calls evil, and we call evil what God calls good. And what happens is that we begin to say, live and let live. It doesn't matter what you do. Just, as long as you feel good, it's good. I'm sure God wants you to be happy, and that's okay. If your God is not fully sovereign, then when something goes wrong, you find yourself panicked. But when you understand that God really is sovereign over all things, that God promises that He works all things together for the good of those who love Him, that God is always working in every circumstance of our lives. That even the bad things, even the times that God, like Job, God allows Satan to come in and touch our lives and to bring maybe whether it's physical health problems or whether it's, family struggles or job struggles or whatever it may be, to understand that God is still sovereign, that God is still working in our lives in those circumstances. But if we don't see Him as sovereign over everything, then we begin to say, man, I don't know if I can trust this God to do the right thing. If your God is the judge of sin, but He's not the faithful, redeeming Father of the cross, then you won't be able to shake that feeling that you are condemned and you need to prove yourself. Man, it's amazing how Satan can bring up stuff from when we were 12, 13 years old, or I'm going to say my life. He'll bring up stuff that happened forever ago into my life and say, man, golly, how can you be a pastor when you did this or that? How can you be, maybe it wasn't 12, but when I was young, I mean, how can you serve God when you did this or you said that, or you treated this person that way or whatever it may be? And we begin to question and we begin to doubt because we've lost sight of the fact that we serve a faithful and we serve a redeeming Father, and the cross clearly demonstrates God's love and His mercy for us. And that so often we are lugging sin, we're lugging the weight of our past sin around like a chain and ball. God's already broken God set us free, and yet we're still carrying it around, and we're just beating ourselves. We are whipping ourselves about the past, and God is saying, what are you doing? You've been forgiven. Get up and keep moving. But as long as we keep lugging that past around with us, God can never use us because we're too busy being introspective about our life and understand that God takes broken pots and uses them for His glory. Listen, if your God is the ruler, but He's not beautiful and all-satisfying in Himself, you'll find yourself yearning after sin, and you'll be envious of what non-Christians enjoy. And you'll find yourself being pulled in those directions. Man, I can't believe I'm having to miss out on this. But when you begin to acknowledge that God is not only the ruler of all creation, but He is beautiful, and He Himself can satisfy all of our deepest needs where nothing else can. Listen, a distorted view of God leads us to a distorted spiritual life that will keep us crippled in our spiritual walk. The third thing is that counterfeit gods disappoint us bitterly. One of the saddest things about Israel's creation of their own God is that they inherited this God they created that they had to take care of him. I mean, isn't that a sad place to be? You invent a God and you've got to take care of this God that you created. I mean, he couldn't walk as the nation was traveling around. They had to pick him up and carry him. They had to dust the dust off of him. I mean, you think about many of the folks that Buddy and them work with. I mean, they go and they offer food to their idols because those idols are not able to feed themselves. You think about that. If you have a God that you have to feed because he can't feed himself, then you got a little power over him, don't you? And you go and you offer that food to this false God, and you can say, God, you better answer my prayer. I won't bring you no food next week. And so God becomes in bondage to us. What kind of God is that? This we see exactly in the people of Israel. We think about this reality. I may have got ahead of myself a little bit, but the God they created had to be carried from place to place when the real God, the true God, the one God, had promised that he would carry them to the promised land like an eagle that would pick them up and would literally carry them to the promised land. And yet, instead, they're chasing after this false God. They have to literally carry around place to place. The real God had promised that he would supply all of their needs, that he would protect them when they were afraid, and he would satisfy them when they were hungry, and that he promised that he would never leave them or forsake them. And yet now we find them exchanging the one true God, who is big enough to meet every need, for a God with a little g, who is too small to even hear their needs or answer their prayers. As a matter of fact, he couldn't even take care of himself, much less take care of their problems. Listen, every day we're faced with a choice. We can put our trust in a fake God who never confuses us, he never contradicts us, but who is unable to deliver us in the day of trouble. Or we can put our trust in the real God who is beyond our understanding and our control, who sometimes confuses us, sometimes things don't seem to make sense, sometimes he even contradicts us, but he has the power to save and to sustain us. The choice that we must make every day is, will we serve a God who is small enough to be understood, or will we serve a God who is big enough to be worshiped? That is our choices. Let's pray together.